The letter that arrived at Peter Horry's Waccamaw plantation in October 1808 carried the weight of betrayal wrapped in innocent parchment. His hands, weathered from 71 years of labor and war, trembled not from age but from rage as he broke the wax seal. Parson Mason Locke Weems, celebrated author of moral biographies, had sent the final manuscript of Francis Marion's life story. The pages transformed 3 years of hell in South Carolina's black water swamps into romantic fiction suitable for parlor reading. Beautiful women swooned over Marion's modesty. Tactical victories materialized through divine providence. The complexity of guerrilla warfare. The moral ambiguity of civil war. The contributions of men who bled alongside Marion in the mud, all sanitized into patriotic mythology designed to sell books and inspire children. Horry set the manuscript down before his fury compelled him to tear it apart. The irony burned deeper than anger. He had saved Weems's life in 1781 during a British raid, risking everything to extract civilians from a burning plantation. That terrified young man now repaid the debt by destroying Horry's years of work to preserve historical truth. The real story, carefully documented with Marion before his death in 1795, had been gutted and replaced with monstrous absurdities. But this wasn't where the story began. 28 years earlier, another letter had arrived at this same plantation, one that would cost him everything he owned, but save the nation he would help create. August 1780, the South Carolina low country burned under summer sun and British torches. Smoke columns rose from estates across the coastal plain, visible for miles, each marking another patriot plantation reduced to ash and memory. Peter Horry stood on his veranda, watching the horizon darken with evidence of systematic destruction. He was 43 years old, prosperous, educated in the manner of Huguenot gentry who had fled French persecution after Louis XIV revoked the Edict of Nantes in 1685. His grandfather Daniel had arrived in Charleston carrying little except desperate determination and valuable skills. 3 generations of careful work had built the Waccamaw estate into substantial prosperity. Hundreds of acres producing indigo and rice, dozens of enslaved workers, barns full of equipment, a comfortable house reflecting success earned through calculation and management. Everything to lose, nothing left worth keeping without liberty. A rider materialized from the tree line, horse lathered and exhausted. The man carried news that transformed possibility into certainty. Charleston had fallen in May after 6 weeks of siege. 5,000 Continental soldiers now languished in British prison hulks. General Benjamin Lincoln had surrendered not just his army, but the entire military infrastructure of South Carolina. 376 barrels of gunpowder, 10,000 muskets, 400 cannon, 6,000 artillery rounds. In a single catastrophic day, the rebellion's capacity to fight in the South had ceased to exist. The rider departed toward the next plantation, carrying his burden of terrible knowledge. Horry remained on the veranda as sunset painted the smoke columns orange and red. His wife Margaret found him there, face illuminated by distant fires. They're offering terms. Protection for those who swear loyalty. I know. Peter, we could keep everything. The children would be safe. Under British rule. Under any rule that doesn't burn our home. He turned to face her, seeing fear and pragmatism warring in her expression. My grandfather fled persecution, crossed an ocean to escape tyranny, built this from nothing because here, a man could be free. What did he run toward if we surrender what he won? He ran toward survival. Same thing I'm asking you to choose. Survival isn't living if you submit to what you know is wrong. She studied his face, reading the decision already made. You'll fight. I will. Then we'll lose everything. Probably. The word hung between them, honest and terrible. Margaret's shoulders sagged with the weight of certainty. She had married a calculated man, methodical in business and planning. This decision carried none of that careful consideration. Pure moral certainty overriding practical wisdom. When do they come for us? Soon. Anyone refusing British protection becomes a target. She nodded, already calculating what could be hidden, what must be abandoned, where children might find safety. The practical work of preparing for catastrophe. Horry watched her retreat inside, then turned back to the darkening horizon. Somewhere in those swamps and forests, Patriots were gathering. Small bands refusing to accept defeat. He would find them, join them, fight until victory or death resolved the question. The decision made, he felt the strange calm of irrevocable commitment. 3 nights later, hoofbeats thundered up the plantation road well after midnight. Horry woke to Margaret shaking his shoulder, urgent whisper cutting through sleep. British cavalry, a dozen at least. He dressed quickly, brain calculating possibilities. Too late to hide anything of value. Too late to flee. The riders weren't here for conversation. He descended the stairs as pounding began on the front door, aggressive and impatient. Opening it revealed a British captain in dragoon uniform, face shadowed beneath his helmet but posture radiating authority. "Peter Horry? I am. You're summoned to take the oath of loyalty to His Majesty's government. Refuse, and your property is forfeit under military law." "I refuse." The captain stepped closer, lowering his voice so his men couldn't hear. "Peter, it's Samuel. Samuel Blackwood." Recognition crashed through Horry's shock. The face beneath the helmet belonged to his childhood friend, the boy who had learned to ride horses at this very plantation, who had fished the Waccamaw together during endless summers. Samuel Blackwood, who had chosen the Loyalist side when war fractured South Carolina society. "Samuel, sign the oath. Keep your family safe. This doesn't have to end in disaster." "I can't." Blackwood's jaw tightened. "Can't or won't?" "Both." "Then you understand what happens now." "I do." Blackwood turned to his dragoons. "Search the house. Seize all weapons, powder, and military stores. Then burn it." The soldiers moved with efficient brutality born from executing identical orders at dozens of estates. They hauled out muskets, powder horns, shot bags, anything that might arm resistance. Enslaved workers were roused from their quarters, ordered to stand in the yard. Margaret and the children emerged in nightclothes, faces blank with shock. Horry watched dragoons pile furniture against walls, splash lamp oil across floors, stack kindling beneath load-bearing timbers. Blackwood supervised the preparations, face professionally neutral. But as soldiers prepared torches, Horry saw moisture on his friend's cheek, reflecting firelight. Samuel Blackwood was crying while ordering Peter Horry's life destroyed. "Why?" Blackwood didn't pretend confusion. "Because you won't bend. Because rebellion has to cost something unbearable or it never ends. Because General Clinton ordered every Patriot estate burned until South Carolina submits. And you execute those orders. I'm a soldier. You'd do the same." "No, I wouldn't burn my friend's life." "Then you're better than me. Or more foolish. I can't decide which." The first torch touched the veranda. Fire caught immediately, hungry and fast. Within minutes, flames roared through the interior, consuming 20 years of accumulated life. Horry stood with Margaret and the children, watching generations of work collapse into orange destruction. Heat washed over them in waves. Smoke carried the stench of burning possessions, each scent a memory turning to ash. The enslaved workers watched in silence, faces unreadable. Among them stood Jacob, the groom who had taught Horry's children to ride, who managed the plantation's horses with intuitive genius. Their eyes met across the firelight. Jacob's expression held something complex, neither satisfaction nor sympathy. Perhaps recognition that catastrophe reshuffled all established order, creating possibility from destruction. By dawn, only the chimneys remained, brick columns pointing accusingly at heaven. Everything else, ash and coals and twisted metal. The dragoons had departed before sunrise, leaving the Horry family standing in the ruins of prosperity. Margaret held the youngest children, face set in grim determination. The older children stared at nothing, overwhelmed by sudden poverty. Horry surveyed the devastation with strange clarity. If we have nothing left to protect, we have nothing left to lose. Margaret understood immediately. "You're going to fight." "Yes." "For how long?" "Until we win, or until I'm dead." She didn't argue. The decision had been made 3 nights ago. The fire simply confirmed it. "Where will you go?" "The swamps. Find whoever's still resisting." "And us?" "North Carolina. Your sister's family. Take the children somewhere the war hasn't reached." "When will we see you again?" "When South Carolina is free." They both understood he might be promising something impossible. British military power had crushed organized resistance. Guerrilla bands in the swamps seemed futile gestures against inevitable occupation. But futility didn't erase moral necessity. The family departed that afternoon, cramming salvaged possessions into a wagon. Horry embraced each child, memorizing faces that might grow up without him. Margaret kissed him once, fierce and desperate. Don't die heroically. Die old in bed, surrounded by grandchildren. I'll do my best. Your best got us burned out. Try something different. Despite everything, he smiled. She could still surprise him with pragmatic truth cutting through sentiment. After they left, Horry walked through the ruins alone. The house's skeleton stood black against afternoon sky. Barns had collapsed completely, fields stretched untended, crops rotting from neglect. A lifetime of work erased in one night of politically motivated arson. He should feel despair. Instead, clarity. The British had simplified his choice by removing alternatives. No property to protect meant no reason to compromise. No family dependence meant freedom to risk everything. They had tried to break him and instead forged something harder. Jacob approached from the demolished slave quarters, moving with careful deference despite the changed circumstances. Colonel Horry, I'm not a colonel. You will be. The certainty in Jacob's voice carried prophetic weight. What will you do now? The British declared all slaves in patriot households forfeit. I can claim freedom, or I can be seized by loyalists. Which will you choose? Neither. I'm coming with you. Horry stared at him, processing implications. To join the resistance? To help you fight? You're not obligated. You're free. Jacob's laugh held no humor. Free to what? Starve in the swamps alone? Get recaptured and sold south? At least with you, I'm choosing my risk. I can't promise safety. Nobody can. But you kept your word when you owned me. That's better odds than most offer. The logic was irrefutable and devastating. Jacob's freedom meant choosing which danger to face, not escaping danger entirely. Horry extended his hand. Jacob took it. Not master and slave anymore. Two men gambling survival on the same desperate cause. Where do we find Marion? Snow's Island, in the PD River swamps. That's what people say. Then that's where we go. They left the plantation at sunset, carrying what weapons had been hidden before the raid. 2 muskets, a rifle, powder horns, shot bags. Horry led his best horse, the one animal Blackwood's dragoons had somehow overlooked. Jacob walked beside him. Behind them, the chimneys stood sentinel over destruction. The swamps swallowed them by nightfall. South Carolina's low country presented terrain unlike anything European military doctrine anticipated. From the Atlantic coast inland for 40 or 50 miles, the landscape dissolved into a maze of cypress swamps, blackwater rivers, and dense forests punctuated by occasional patches of solid ground. The great rivers, the PD, Santee, Cooper, and Ashley, created massive floodplains that remained saturated year-round. Cypress trees rose from water ranging from ankle-deep to bottomless, their trunks buttressed and strange, Spanish moss hanging from every branch, like gray-green curtains blocking sunlight even at midday. The water appeared still but concealed fierce currents beneath the surface. What looked like solid ground could collapse into sucking mud that trapped horses and men. What seemed like mud could actually be solid earth covered in thin water film. Learning these distinctions required years of experience. British soldiers simply drowned or got lost. Horry had hunted these swamps since childhood. He knew the safe paths, the hidden causeways, the islands that offered dry camping. This knowledge transformed what British forces perceived as hostile wilderness into defensive infrastructure. You couldn't garrison the swamps. You couldn't march armies through them. You couldn't bring wagons or artillery. But small bands of men who knew the terrain could move freely, strike without warning, and vanish before response materialized. It took Horry and Jacob 2 days to reach Snow's Island. They moved carefully, avoiding British patrols and Loyalist sympathizers, sleeping in concealed positions, traveling mostly at night. The swamps lived with sound and danger. Alligator bellows that vibrated through water, mosquito swarms so thick they darkened air. water moccasins draping from low branches like deadly decorations. Heat and humidity made every mile exhausting. Sweat soaked through clothes in minutes. Water surrounded them everywhere, but drinking swamp water meant dysentery, so they carried canteens and rationed carefully. On the second night, they found the island. Snow's Island wasn't marked on military maps. A patch of high ground in the Petey River swamp system, perhaps 5 acres of dry land surrounded by black water and maze-like channels. Access required knowing which approaches were navigable and which led to dead ends or alligator nests. British forces could search for years and never locate it. Francis Marion's camp occupied the island's center. Not a proper military camp with tents and order, but a collection of men sleeping under trees, cooking over small fires, maintaining weapons with whatever supplies they possessed. Horry counted perhaps 20 men, ranging from teenagers to grizzled veterans. They wore civilian clothes, homespun hunting shirts and breeches, no uniforms, no flags, no indication of military organization beyond the weapons they carried. A sentry challenged them at the island's edge, musket leveled. "State your business." "Peter Horry, looking for Colonel Marion." "Why?" "To join him." The sentry studied them, evaluating sincerity and threat. "Wait here." He disappeared into the camp. Minutes passed. Mosquitoes found them immediately, biting through clothes. Jacob slapped at his neck, drawing blood. "This is where we're volunteering to stay?" "Unless you have better options." "Not a one." The sentry returned with a small man, barely 5 feet tall, slight build, moving with a limp that suggested old injury. Francis Marion at 48 looked nothing like a warrior. No martial bearing, no physical presence that commanded attention. He dressed plainly, spoke softly, displayed none of the swagger that military culture celebrated, but his eyes evaluated everything with systematic intelligence, seeing through surfaces to underlying structures. "Peter Horry, I know your family. Your grandfather helped mine establish property rights after emigrating. Then you know we keep our commitments." "I know that. What I don't know is why a prosperous planter would join 20 desperate men hiding in a swamp." "I'm not prosperous anymore. The British burned my plantation 3 days ago." Marion's expression didn't change, but something in his eyes acknowledged the shared experience. "They burned mine in '79. I've lived in these swamps since. Sometimes I think the trees are my only real property now." "Then we have similar circumstances." "Not quite. I have nothing left to lose." "You still have family." "In North Carolina. Safe. For now." Families become leverage quickly in civil war. Horry hadn't considered that angle. The thought of Margaret or the children seized for political pressure sent ice through his chest despite the summer heat. Marion continued, relentless in his honesty. "Joining us means accepting that you might die forgotten in this swamp. No glory, no recognition, probably no victory, just endless danger until the British kill us or we somehow win." "I understand." "Do you?" Most men think they do, then realize guerrilla warfare isn't romantic. It's murder from ambush, burning supply wagons, killing neighbors who chose wrong, living in mud, eating whatever we can steal or hunt. No pay, no support. If you're captured, they'll hang you as a criminal, not hold you as a prisoner of war. "I still want to join." Marion studied him for a long moment, then nodded. "You have military experience?" "Militia service during the Cherokee War. Some frontier fighting." "So you know how to shoot and take orders." "I know how to lead. I ran a plantation for 20 years, managed complex operations, directed workers, solved logistics problems." Marion's eyes sharpened with interest. "That's actually useful. Most men who join can fight but can't plan. Guerrilla warfare needs both." "What about him?" Marion indicated Jacob, standing slightly behind Horry. "Jacob, my former groom. He's free now and chooses to fight." Marion's eyebrows rose fractionally. First freedman to volunteer. "You understand what that means? The complications?" Jacob spoke for himself. "I understand that if the British win, I'm property again. If you win, I'm free. Simple mathematics." "Nothing about this war is simple." "Then I'll learn complicated." Marion almost smiled. "You'll both stay. We need every man willing to fight, and we especially need men who can think. But understand the rules. I command strategy. You execute tactics. When I say move, we move. When I say hide, we hide. When I say fight, we fight. No debate, no hesitation. Lives depend on instant obedience. Understood. Good. Find space to sleep. We move camp tomorrow before dawn. Marion turned away, dismissing them to integrate into the band. Horry and Jacob found space beneath a massive cypress tree, settling onto ground that was merely damp rather than flooded. Around them, Marion's men prepared evening meals over carefully managed fires. The smoke dispersed through tree canopy, so no visible column betrayed their position. One militiaman approached, offering sweet potatoes roasted in coals. "Welcome to paradise. Hope you like mosquitoes and hunger." Horry accepted the food gratefully. "I've experienced worse." "When?" "About 4 hours from now, when we're trying to sleep." The militiaman laughed, genuine and tired. "You'll fit in fine." That night, Horry lay on damp ground, listening to swamp sounds and thinking about the path that led here. 3 days ago, he had been a prosperous planter with everything to lose. Now he owned a musket, a horse, and commitment to a cause that seemed mathematically impossible. 20 men hiding in a swamp could not defeat the British Empire. Every rational calculation suggested futility, but guerrilla warfare wasn't about rationality. It was about mathematics of a different kind. You didn't need to defeat the enemy. You needed to make victory cost more than they would pay. Every ambush, every disrupted supply convoy, every loyalist militia too afraid to operate, these accumulated into strategic effect far beyond their tactical significance. The British could win every battle and still lose the war if occupation became unsustainable. Marion understood this instinctively. Over the next weeks, Horry learned the operational system that made Marion effective despite impossible odds. They maintained mobile camps that moved every few days, never establishing patterns that British scouts could predict. They struck supply convoys traveling between Charleston and interior garrisons, seizing desperately needed weapons and food while denying those resources to British forces. They ambushed loyalist militia companies, making service so dangerous that recruitment collapsed. They burned bridges to slow British movements. They intercepted messengers, gathering intelligence about enemy plans. Each operation was carefully planned to maximize impact while minimizing risk. Marion never gambled unnecessarily. He studied intelligence reports, evaluated terrain, calculated odds, then struck only when advantage was overwhelming. This methodical approach frustrated militiamen who wanted dramatic action, but it kept the brigade alive and effective. Dead heroes won nothing. Living guerrillas fighting another day accumulated victories impossible through reckless courage. Horry absorbed these lessons with the systematic attention he had applied to plantation management. Guerrilla warfare had principles. Know terrain better than your enemy. Use mobility to offset numerical weakness. Strike where unexpected at times of your choosing. Avoid decisive battles you couldn't win. Protect civilian populations who provided intelligence and supplies. These weren't abstract theories. They were practical doctrine derived from Cherokee War experience and adapted to fighting European military forces. Marion recognized Horry's competence quickly. Within a month, he assigned him as second in command, trusting him to execute operations independently. The role required complementary skills to Marion's strategic vision. Marion saw how guerrilla campaigns fit into broader war efforts, maintained political relationships with civilian patriots, and made decisions about when and where to operate. Horry provided tactical execution, turning strategic objectives into battlefield reality, planning specific operations in meticulous detail, leading combat missions personally, and handling daily command decisions. The partnership worked because neither competed for authority. Marion commanded clearly, making final decisions without ambiguity. Horry accepted that hierarchy without resentment, understanding that effective organizations required clear command structures. But Marion trusted Horry completely to execute independent operations, often detaching him with a portion of their force to strike one target while Marion hit another. This multiplication of effort made British and Loyalist forces believe Marion's brigade was far larger than its actual 30 to 70 men. In September 1780, Marion assigned Horry his first independent command. Intelligence reported that Loyalist Captain John Bull commanded 46 militia near Black Mingo Creek, close to Willtown Bridge in northeastern South Carolina. These Loyalist units were particularly problematic because they were locally recruited, knew the terrain, and provided occupation forces that freed British regulars for campaigning elsewhere. Marion decided Bull's force needed elimination before it consolidated control. "Can you handle this?" Horry understood the test implicit in the question. Could he plan and execute the kind of sudden, violent assault guerrilla warfare required? Would men follow him into danger when following Marion was established practice? "I can. Take 30 men, hit them at dawn, total surprise, overwhelming violence, then withdraw immediately before British reinforcements arrive." Understood. Horry spent 2 days planning meticulously. He studied intelligence reports about Bull's camp location, size, and routine. He sent scouts forward to observe the position, confirm numbers, identify approaches, and locate sentries. He selected men carefully, choosing those known for reliability under fire and ability to follow orders in confused night actions. He studied terrain around Black Mingo Creek, identifying approach routes offering concealment and withdrawal paths if attack went wrong. The evening before the raid, Jacob approached with information that changed everything. "I know where Bull camps, exactly." "How?" "I found it. Scouted personally." Horry stared at him. "You went alone into hostile territory?" "Nobody else knows the area like I do. I worked plantations throughout this region before you owned me. I know every trail, every creek crossing, every patch of solid ground." "That was incredibly dangerous." "Everything we do is dangerous. At least this danger might save lives." Jacob sketched a map in dirt showing Bull's exact position, the plantation house they occupied, sentry positions, horse lines, everything needed for perfect assault planning. The intelligence was precise and actionable, transforming vague estimates into tactical certainty. Horry studied the map, then Jacob. "Why risk this?" "Because if we lose tomorrow, men die unnecessarily. If we win with good intelligence, maybe fewer die. You're not property anymore. You could leave. Find safety somewhere." Jacob's expression hardened. "Safety doesn't exist. Not for me, not for you, not for anyone until this war ends. I'm fighting because sitting still means waiting to be taken by whoever wins. At least fighting gives me choice in the matter." The logic was irrefutable. Liberty meant choosing your danger, not escaping it. Horry extended his hand. "Thank you." Jacob gripped it firmly. "Win tomorrow. That's thanks enough." They moved through darkness toward Black Mingo Creek on September 28th. The column rode in silence, 30 men on horses walking slowly to minimize noise. Conversation was forbidden. Equipment secured so nothing rattled. Every mile brought them deeper into territory where British patrols might appear without warning. Horry rode near the front, using Jacob as guide through paths only locals knew existed. Hours passed in tense quiet as they navigated through forests and around swamps. The night was moonless, navigation by starlight and intimate terrain knowledge. Twice they stopped, hearing distant sounds that might indicate enemy presence. Both times the sounds faded into normal swamp noise. Alligators bellowing, owls hunting, wind through moss-draped trees. Perhaps an hour before dawn, they reached positions near Bull's camp. The men dismounted quietly, checking weapons and preparing for assault. Horry moved among them, whispering final instructions. When dawn light began filtering through trees, providing barely enough visibility to distinguish friend from enemy, he gave the signal with a raised hand. The Patriot militia charged. The attack caught Bull's loyalists in the vulnerable morning routine. Some still slept. Others prepared breakfast or tended horses, all the domestic activities that happened in military camps when guards relaxed and men believed themselves safe. Suddenly, Patriot militia thundered into their position on horseback, pistols firing, sabers slashing. The shock was absolute and overwhelming. Men scrambled for weapons without time to organize coordinated defense. Officers shouted conflicting orders that nobody could hear over gunfire, roar, and screaming horses. Some loyalists tried forming defensive lines, but Horry's momentum broke them before establishing formation. The fighting was vicious, close range, utterly chaotic in ways that textbooks never captured. Pistols fired at point-blank range, riders slashing downward with sabers at men on foot, horses knocking over tents and campfires. Smoke from black powder drifted through the scene, making visibility even worse. Men grappled hand-to-hand over weapons, while others ran for tree lines, hoping to escape. Horry fought in the center of chaos, pistol in one hand, saber in the other. A loyalist militiaman charged him with a bayoneted musket. Horry fired, the ball catching the man in the shoulder and spinning him sideways. Another appeared from smoke, swinging a musket like a club. Horry ducked under the blow and drove his saber into the man's side, feeling the blade scrape against ribs before pulling free. Blood splattered across his hand, hot and sticky. The entire action lasted perhaps 10 minutes from first shot to surrender. When firing stopped, 3 loyalists lay dead. 13 suffered wounds serious enough to end their fighting. 23 surrendered, unharmed and shocked. Horry's force had 3 men wounded, none critically. They seized substantial quantities of weapons, including British military muskets far superior to most militia arms. They captured horses that Horry's chronically horse-poor force desperately needed. More importantly, they destroyed a loyalist stronghold, eliminating more than half the force and sending survivors fleeing toward British protection. The psychological impact exceeded tactical results. Loyalist militias throughout the region would hear about Black Mingo Creek and hesitate before volunteering for service that promised sudden violence from darkness. As morning light strengthened, Horry walked through the captured camp. Bodies lay where they had fallen. Wounded men groaned or whimpered, waiting for whatever mercy captors chose to offer. One of the wounded loyalists, a boy barely 16, stared up at Horry with recognition dawning through pain. "Colonel Horry, you taught me to ride when I was small. You visited my father's plantation every spring." Memory returned. This boy's father was a neighboring planter, a friend who had served with Horry in the Cherokee War. They had shared dinners, discussed crops and politics, celebrated births and mourned deaths together. Then war fractured South Carolina society along ideological lines. The neighbor chose loyalty to Britain. His son joined a loyalist militia company. Now the boy lay bleeding from wounds Horry's men had inflicted. The Civil War nature of the conflict crashed home with devastating clarity. This wasn't glory. This was tragedy with necessary winners and unbearable costs. Horry knelt beside the boy, checking his wound. A musket ball had passed through his thigh, missing the bone and major vessels. Painful but survivable with basic care. "You'll live. We'll bind this and leave you for British surgeons to find." "Why? Why are you fighting your neighbors?" "Because some things matter more than neighborly comfort. My father says you're traitors. My grandfather said submission to tyranny is worse than death. We're both honoring our fathers, just in opposite directions." The boy didn't respond, overwhelmed by pain and confusion. Horry stood, gesturing for militiamen to treat the wounded before withdrawing. Marion's orders were clear: inflict maximum damage, then vanish before British reinforcements arrived. Mercy where possible, but never at the cost of mission failure. They departed Black Mingo Creek within 30 minutes of the final shot, driving captured horses and carrying seized weapons. Behind them, wounded loyalists waited for help that would arrive too late to pursue. By the time British forces responded to reports of the raid, Horry's detachment was 15 miles away, dissolved back into swamps like morning mist under Carolina sun. Marion received them at the relocated camp with quiet satisfaction. He inspected the captured weapons, counted horses, listened to Horry's tactical report. When Horry finished, Marion nodded once. "Well executed. You've proven yourself capable of independent command. From now on, I'll trust you to handle operations requiring tactical judgment." The words were simple, but their meaning resonated through the camp. Horry wasn't just Marion's administrative assistant or strategic advisor. He was a combat commander capable of planning operations, leading men into danger, and delivering victories. This mattered enormously for maintaining militia morale and recruiting new volunteers throughout patriot communities in South Carolina. That night, as the brigade settled into temporary security, Horry sat apart with Jacob. They cleaned weapons in companionable silence, both processing what they had experienced. Finally, Jacob spoke. "You knew that boy." "I did. Does that make it harder?" "Yes. But you'd do it again? I would. Why? Horry considered the question carefully. Because the alternative is accepting rule by people who will burn your life for disagreeing with them. That's not a future worth preserving, regardless of who gets hurt stopping it. Jacob absorbed this. I suppose that's the difference between fighting for something and fighting against something. You're doing both. So are you. Maybe, or maybe I'm just choosing the danger that offers the best odds of survival. That's still a choice. Most people never get that much. They finished cleaning weapons as stars emerged overhead, visible through gaps in the cypress canopy. Around them, Marion's brigade prepared for another day of guerrilla warfare, another rotation of survival and violence that might somehow, impossibly, accumulate into independence. Horry thought about Samuel Blackwood crying while his life burned, about the boy at Black Mingo recognizing his childhood teacher through blood and shock, about Margaret and the children safe in North Carolina, or so he hoped. About the choice he had made, liberty over property, principle over pragmatism, commitment over comfort. The path forward promised nothing except more violence, more moral complexity, more neighbors killing neighbors until one vision of America prevailed. But backing away now meant accepting that power determined justice, that military force created legitimacy, that burning homes until submission was acceptable governance. He couldn't accept that, so he would fight until the question resolved itself through victory or death. There were worse ways to spend a life than struggling for something larger than personal survival. The swamps held their secrets close that night, sheltering desperate men gambling everything on the improbable wager that courage and determination might somehow offset overwhelming British military superiority. Morning would bring new operations, new dangers, new impossible choices, but tonight they had won at Black Mingo Creek. They had proven guerrilla warfare could produce results. They had demonstrated that South Carolina patriots would resist occupation regardless of cost. That was enough. For now. Winter descended on South Carolina with cold rain that soaked through everything and temperatures that dropped into the 30s, turning the swamps from oppressive heat into bone-deep chill. Horry learned that misery had seasons. Summer brought mosquitoes, malaria, and dehydration despite being surrounded by undrinkable water. Winter brought pneumonia, hypothermia, and the impossibility of staying dry when every position flooded and no firewood remained unsaturated. The brigade moved every 3 days, maintaining operational security that kept British forces perpetually searching for phantoms they could never pin down. Through December 1780 and January 1781, Horry led a dozen independent operations. Supply convoy ambushes along the Camden Road, raids on Loyalist militia gatherings, bridge demolitions that forced British forces onto longer, more vulnerable routes, messenger interceptions that yielded intelligence about enemy dispositions and intentions. Each action followed Marion's doctrine: strike with overwhelming advantage, inflict maximum damage, withdraw before enemy response materialize. The mathematics remained constant. 30 guerrillas risking 1 hour could tie down 300 British soldiers for days, force convoys to double their guards, and make occupation progressively more expensive than any benefit justified. In late January, General Nathaniel Greene arrived to take command of Continental forces in the South. He was Washington's most talented strategist, a Rhode Island Quaker who had abandoned pacifism to fight for independence. Greene immediately grasped what conventional commanders missed. You couldn't defeat superior British forces through traditional warfare. You needed something unconventional. He divided his already small army into mobile detachments that threatened multiple British positions simultaneously, forcing enemy dispersal, then concentrated for brief decisive actions before dispersing again. The strategy required guerrilla forces like Marion and Horry to support Continental operations by disrupting British supply lines, providing intelligence about enemy movements, and preventing British concentration against Greene's scattered detachments. Greene met with Marion in February at a carefully arranged rendezvous. Horry attended, seeing Continental military professionalism encounter swamp guerrilla pragmatism. Greene studied Marion and Horry with the systematic evaluation of a man who recognized competence regardless of appearance. Marion looked like a malarial scarecrow. Horry's clothes were patched homespun, his boots held together with strips of leather. Neither resembled officers in any army Green had served. "Gentlemen, I need your help." Marion's response was characteristically direct. "What kind of help?" "The kind that keeps British forces confused, undersupplied, and unable to concentrate against my operations. I can't defeat them in pitched battle with the forces I have, but I can make them chase shadows while their logistics collapse." "You're the shadows." "We've been doing that for 6 months." "I know, which is why I'm here asking for coordination rather than ordering you to do what you're already doing. I need intelligence about British movements between Charleston and Camden. I need their supply convoys disrupted continuously. I need them to believe Patriot strength is far greater than reality." "Can you provide that?" Horry spoke up. "We can, but we need ammunition. Our men are shooting squirrels with precious powder because we can't waste rounds on target practice. I'll arrange supply deliveries. Not much, but enough to keep you operational. In return, I need detailed reports. Where British forces move, when convoys travel, what garrisons are reinforced or abandoned. That information shapes my entire strategy." Marion nodded slowly. "We're not regular army. My men come and go as farming requires. I can't promise availability. I'm not asking for regulars. I'm asking for exactly what you provide. Persistent harassment that makes British occupation unsustainable. Do that, and we might actually win this war." The meeting established operational relationship that transformed Marion and Horry from isolated guerrillas into integrated components of Green's Southern campaign. They remained independent in execution, but coordinated in purpose. Green's Continental forces conducted conventional operations, while Marion and Horry disrupted British responses. Together, conventional and guerrilla forces created strategic effects neither could achieve alone. In March, intelligence reached Marion about a British fortification that blocked Green's advance. Fort Watson sat atop an ancient Native American ceremonial mound called Santee Mound, overlooking the Santee River and controlling crucial supply routes between Charleston and Camden. The position seemed nearly impregnable, a 40-foot earthen mound with steep sides, topped by a stockade with sharpened log walls and firing ports. Lieutenant James Mackay commanded approximately 80 British regulars plus Loyalist militia. Clear fields of fire extended hundreds of yards in all directions. Any attacking force would climb the exposed mound under concentrated fire with no cover. British engineers had designed Fort Watson specifically to be impossible to capture without artillery. Green's forces had no artillery. Marion showed Horry the intelligence reports, sketches indicating the fort's position and defenses. "Green needs this taken. It's blocking his entire advance northward. Without artillery, conventional assault is suicide. Then we need unconventional assault." "Suggestions?" Horry studied the sketches, seeing the tactical problem with painful clarity. Approach trenches would take weeks to dig, and British reinforcements would arrive long before completion. Direct assault meant climbing 40 feet of exposed slope, while defenders shot downward with perfect targeting. Siege by starvation would fail because the fort had adequate provisions and secure water supply from an interior well. Every conventional option failed against the basic geometry of height advantage and clear fields of fire. "What if we change the geometry?" Marion's eyes sharpened with interest. "Explain." "They're shooting down at us because they're higher. If we build something higher, we shoot down at them." "Build what?" "We have no siege equipment." "We have trees, lots of trees." Understanding dawned across Marion's face. "A tower, tall enough to overlook their walls." "Exactly. Build it outside musket range, then advance it forward on rollers. Top platform holds riflemen who shoot down into the fort. Physics works in our favor instead of theirs." Marion considered this, evaluating feasibility. "It sounds insane. Most successful operations do. Can it actually work?" "Only one way to find out." Marion made the decision with characteristic speed. "We try it. You coordinate construction. I'll handle security and logistics. If this succeeds, every British fort in South Carolina becomes vulnerable. If it fails, we've wasted a week and some timber." They marched toward Fort Watson in mid-April. Marion's brigade, joined by Colonel Henry Lee's Continental Legion Cavalry, and Colonel Hezekiah Maham's South Carolina militia. The combined force numbered perhaps 300 men, substantial by guerrilla standards, but inadequate for conventional siege against a fortified position held by disciplined regulars. They arrived April 15th and established positions surrounding the mound, close enough to prevent British sorties, but outside effective musket range. That evening, as commanders debated approaches, a voice spoke from the gathered militia. "I can build your tower, but you won't like who has to lead the work." Horry turned to see Jacob standing at the edge of the command group, face carefully neutral but eyes holding challenge. The silence that followed was profound and uncomfortable. Every officer present understood the implications immediately. Tower construction required engineering expertise and construction management. Jacob possessed both skills from his years apprenticed to a master carpenter before enslavement. But 18th century racial dynamics made accepting leadership from a black man nearly unthinkable for most white militia. "You know timber engineering?" "I do. Learned from a master in Charleston before I was sold south. I've built everything from houses to ship frames. A siege tower is just applied mathematics and carpentry." Colonel Lee spoke up, skepticism evident. "No disrespect intended, but tower construction under enemy fire requires leadership. Men need to trust who's directing them." Jacob's response came sharp and direct. "Men need to trust someone who knows what they're doing. I know what I'm doing. Question is whether you'd rather have a tower that works or one that collapses because nobody understood load-bearing calculations." Horry stepped into the tension. "Jacob designed the intelligence network that made Black Mingo Creek successful. He's proven capable of planning operations that save lives. This is no different." Marion ended the debate with command decision. Jacob designs and directs construction. Colonel Horry supervises as military commander. Anyone uncomfortable with those arrangements can leave now. 3 militiamen stood and walked away. The rest remained, acceptance or pragmatism overcoming prejudice. Jacob nodded acknowledgement, then pulled out charcoal and began sketching specifications on a plank. The design emerged with professional precision, modular sections that could be assembled separately, then joined into a tower 45 feet tall, with cross bracing to prevent collapse under its own weight in horizontal platforms at intervals for structural support in eventual rifleman positions. The top platform would extend slightly over one edge, allowing shooters to fire directly down into the fort at an angle impossible to defend against. Construction began at dawn on April 16th. Work parties moved into nearby forests to cut suitable timber, while Jacob marked trees with the specific dimensions needed. British sentries watched from Fort Watson's walls, initially confused about what the activity meant. By mid-morning, understanding dawned. Lieutenant McKay ordered his men to direct harassing fire at the work parties, hoping to kill enough workers to make construction impossible. Horry organized the operation like a military campaign. Riflemen established suppression positions, firing at any British soldier careless enough to expose himself on the fort's walls. This didn't stop British fire, but reduced its accuracy and volume. Work parties operated in shifts, fresh men replacing exhausted ones every few hours, so construction never stopped. Timber came back to the assembly area in steady flow, logs stripped of branches and cut to specified lengths. Jacob moved between work sites, checking dimensions and making constant adjustments to the design as realities of available materials required modification. The first casualty came on April 17th when a British musket ball struck a militia carpenter in the shoulder. The man screamed and fell, blood pouring from the wound. His work party froze, seeing mortality made real. Horry appeared immediately, pulling the wounded man to cover while maintaining calm authority. "Bind that wound and get him to the surgeon. Everyone else back to work. Standing still makes you easier targets than moving does." The psychology was calculated. Acknowledge the danger, but don't let it stop progress. Men returned to work, though hands shook slightly as they lifted logs. Jacob increased the pace, recognizing that fear grew when men had time to think. Keep them busy with immediate tasks, and they wouldn't dwell on becoming the next casualty. By April 18th, the tower's skeletal frame stood 15 feet tall, looking impossibly fragile and somehow strong simultaneously. Jacob's engineering proved sound. The structure swayed slightly in wind, but held together under its own weight. British fire intensified as McKay realized the threat materializing before him. Musket balls thudded into timber with steady percussion. Several lodged in structural members, but the green wood absorbed impact without splintering catastrophically. That afternoon, British forces attempted a sortie to burn the tower. Approximately 30 soldiers burst from the fort's gate, carrying torches and racing toward the construction site. Horry had anticipated exactly this response. Riflemen hidden in concealed positions opened fire immediately, dropping 3 British soldiers in the first volley. Horry led a mounted counterattack with 20 cavalry, charging into the British sortie before they reached the tower. The collision was brutal and brief. Sabers clashed against bayonets. Horses trampled men too slow to dodge. Horry personally killed a British sergeant who had reached the tower's base with a lit torch, driving his saber through the man's chest and watching him collapse with flames still flickering in his dying hand. The sortie broke and fled back toward the fort. Horry pursued briefly, then recalled his men. 4 British soldiers lay dead. The tower stood unburned. Mackay wouldn't try that approach again. Horry walked back through the construction site, boots crunching on wood shavings and spent musket balls. His hands still shook from combat adrenaline. The British sergeant's face hung in memory, eyes wide with shock as steel pierced his body. 20 months of guerrilla warfare and death remained shocking every time it arrived personally. Jacob met him at the tower base. "You saved the entire operation. Just doing what's necessary." That sergeant had wife and children. I heard him talking about them before he died. Horry's chest tightened with the weight of that knowledge. "How do you know?" "Because I listened while you were fighting." He kept saying their names. Mary, Thomas, Elizabeth. Over and over until he stopped breathing. The information felt like additional wounds. Killing abstract enemies was one thing. Killing a man whose family would mourn him specifically carried different moral weight. Horry had no response that made it acceptable, so he offered none. Jacob seemed to understand. War doesn't give us good choices, just choices we can live with afterward. Can you live with this? I can live with freedom more than I can live with slavery. Everything else is mathematics. Construction continued through April 19th with relentless determination. The tower reached 45 feet, swaying more noticeably as height increased but remaining structurally sound. Jacob's calculations had accounted for wind stress in the structure's own weight distribution. Additional bracing prevented catastrophic failure. By sunset, the tower was complete. Now came the most dangerous phase, advancing it from the construction site outside musket range to a firing position close enough for riflemen to shoot effectively down into the fort. The advance began at dawn on April 20th. 60 men pushed against the massive structure, while others positioned log rollers underneath. Inch by inch, the tower crept forward across uneven ground. British fire became desperate and continuous. Every defender on the walls fired as fast as they could reload. Musket balls hammered into the tower's front face, creating percussion that sounded like demonic drumming. Splinters flew. Several militiamen were wounded by flying debris. But the tower's bulk absorbed most impacts, and the advance continued with inexorable patience. Horry walked beside the tower, exposed to fire but needing to project confidence. Men took courage from leaders who shared danger. If he cowered behind cover, they would break. So he walked upright through a storm of lead, calculating each step, waiting for the impact that might end everything. It never came. Luck, providence, or simple probability kept him alive through 8 hours of continuous advance. By late afternoon, the tower reached effective firing position. American riflemen climbed to the top platform, moving carefully on timber still slick from construction humidity. They positioned themselves along the extended platform edge and looked down into Fort Watson. The geometry had reversed completely. British defenders designed to repel attacks from below now faced accurate rifle fire from above. They couldn't man their walls without exposing themselves to shooters they couldn't effectively target in return. The defensive advantage that made Fort Watson impregnable had been negated through engineering improvisation. Lieutenant Mackay watched from inside the fort, seeing his position become untenable through pure battlefield innovation. No British military manual addressed this scenario. Doctrine assumed forts provided height advantage. When that assumption reversed, all defensive calculations failed. He could surrender immediately or wait 3 days while American riflemen picked off his garrison one soldier at a time. The choice was obvious even if accepting it burned with professional humiliation. April 23rd, Mackay raised the white flag. Marion accepted surrender with professional courtesy. British regulars marched out with weapons reversed, allowed to retain personal possessions, but yielding all military stores. Loyalist militia received parole, swearing not to fight again. Mackay met Marion and Horry at the fort's entrance, face carefully neutral, but eyes showing strain of command failure. "Gentlemen, you've achieved something I didn't think possible. My compliments on the engineering." Marion's response was gracious. "Credit belongs to Colonel Horry and his construction team. Creative thinking beats conventional doctrine when circumstances demand innovation." Mackay turned to Horry. "May I ask whose idea this was?" "Mine. But execution belonged to someone else." "Who?" Horry gestured toward Jacob, standing with the militia. "That man, former slave who knows more about timber engineering than anyone in either army." Mackay's eyebrows rose. "Extraordinary. The Crown loses because we couldn't imagine a black man might engineer our defeat. There's a lesson in that about assumptions and reality." The honesty was unexpected and somehow honorable. Mackay departed with his paroled garrison, marching toward British lines and uncertain future. Horry watched them go, feeling no triumph. Fort Watson's capture was tactically significant, but strategically just one position among many. The British still held Charleston and dozens of interior posts. This victory opened Greene's advance but didn't end the war. Jacob approached as the British column disappeared from sight. Horry extended his hand without thinking. They gripped firmly, connection transcending the social barriers that said such equality shouldn't exist. "You won this." Jacob's response came quietly. "We won this. Don't diminish your role because you want to be generous. I'm trying to give credit where it's due. Then give it to everyone who pushed that tower forward under fire. Give it to the men who cut timber while being shot at. Give it to Marion for supporting the insane idea. Give it to yourself for having the courage to try something nobody believed would work. There's enough credit that sharing it doesn't diminish anyone." The wisdom in those words transcended their immediate context. Horry realized Jacob possessed not just engineering skill, but philosophical depth that formal education often failed to instill. Intelligence and insight weren't products of schooling. They were inherent capabilities that slavery suppressed but couldn't eliminate. "When this war ends, what will you do?" "Depends on who wins." "We're going to win. Then I'll figure out what freedom actually means beyond not being property." That's a question nobody prepares you to answer. They stood together watching the captured fort, considering futures that remained radically uncertain despite tactical success. Fort Watson had fallen through innovation and determination, but South Carolina held dozens of similar positions. The mathematics of guerrilla warfare required persistent effort, not dramatic breakthroughs. Victory would come through accumulated pressure, not single decisive actions. The spring campaign continued through May and June with systematic aggression. Fort Mott fell on May 12th after Marion's forces used burning arrows to set the fort's wooden roof aflame, forcing British surrender to avoid being burned alive. Fort Granby capitulated on May 15th when its garrison recognized that resistance was mathematically futile against superior besieging forces. Georgetown surrendered on May 28th after Patriot forces surrounded the position and severed all supply roads, making continued defense impossible. Fort 96 held out longer, but ultimately British forces evacuated as untenable. With each victory, British control contracted back toward Charleston and immediate coastal regions. The interior of South Carolina, occupied by British and Loyalist forces since Charleston's fall in 1780, returned to Patriot control within 3 months. The speed of reversal was remarkable and strategically decisive. Greene's conventional operations combined with Marion and Horry's guerrilla harassment had achieved what seemed impossible just 6 months earlier, liberating an entire colony from military occupation without winning any major pitched battle. Success produced its own complications. Marion's brigade grew from 40 men to over 200 as militia recruitment increased dramatically. Men who had remained neutral while waiting to see who would win now joined the Patriots because victory appeared probable. These fence-sitters weren't cowards. They were pragmatists protecting families and property by avoiding commitment until the likely winner became clear. Once British defeat seemed inevitable, joining Patriots became the safer choice politically and physically. The influx of recruits created command challenges Horry hadn't anticipated. New militia lacked the discipline and experience of veterans who had survived 2 years of guerrilla warfare. Some sought revenge more than victory, motivated by personal grievances rather than strategic objectives. Others had minimal combat experience and panicked under fire. Integrating 200 men with varying competence and motivation into operations requiring coordination and discipline tested Horry's leadership in ways that commanding 40 veterans never had. One evening in early June, Horry overheard conversation among recent recruits. They sat around a campfire, speaking in low tones that carried clearly through humid air. The topic was the next operation, a planned attack on a fortified British position at Quimby Bridge. That plantation house is brick, thick walls. They've been fortifying it for weeks. Attacking that without artillery is insanity. Marion's ordered it. He's never steered us wrong before. Marion isn't leading this one. Horry is. And if he orders us into a death trap, some of us aren't going. The words hit Horry like physical impacts. Mutiny. Not formal military mutiny punishable by execution, because militia forces operated under different rules than regular army, but refusal to follow orders in combat was mutiny by any practical definition, and it could collapse the entire operation. Men died when others didn't execute assigned tasks. Hesitation created gaps that enemies exploited. Horry had two choices: ignore the conversation and hope the men would follow orders when action began, or confront the situation directly and risk making it worse through official acknowledgement. He chose confrontation. Walking into the firelight, Horry's presence silenced conversation immediately. The men looked up, guilt and defiance mixing on their faces. Horry spoke calmly, without anger or accusation. "I heard you. You're right that Quimby Bridge is dangerous. Probably the most dangerous operation we've attempted. Here's what I'm going to do. I'm attacking tomorrow as ordered. Anyone who doesn't want to come can leave now. No punishment, no questions, no judgment." Silence stretched while men processed the offer. One spoke up, younger than most, voice uncertain. "You'd let us just walk away? I'd prefer you stay and fight, but I won't force men into combat they don't believe in. Forced soldiers make mistakes that kill themselves and others. Better to have fewer willing men than more unwilling ones." Another militiaman, older and scarred from previous service, challenged directly. "What if we all leave? What if nobody wants to die attacking a brick fortress? Then I'll attack with whoever remains. But understand something clearly. If you stay, you follow orders. Not because I'll shoot you if you don't, not because military law compels obedience, but because men die when others fail to do their assigned jobs. You stay, you commit fully. Half measures in combat guarantee casualties." The men exchanged glances, weighing options. Finally, the older militiaman nodded. "I'll stay. Done enough running in my life." Others murmured agreement. 5 men stood and walked away from the fire, disappearing into darkness toward wherever deserters went. Horry watched them leave without comment. The remaining men seemed galvanized by the confrontation, commitment strengthened through having made explicit choice rather than passive acceptance of orders. But Horry's stomach churned with implications. 5 men had just refused to fight. How many others harbored similar doubts but stayed out of peer pressure rather than conviction? How much could he rely on this enlarged brigade when real danger materialized? The questions had no comfortable answers. July 17th arrived with oppressive heat and humidity that turned the march toward Quimby Bridge into an ordeal. Marion's combined force of approximately 300 militia and Continental cavalry moved through pine forests and across open fields toward the plantation house where British Colonel James Coates had established a fortified position. Intelligence suggested Coates commanded roughly 150 men, but the fortifications made numbers secondary to defensive strength. As they approached, scouts reported details that made Horry's chest tighten with apprehension. The plantation house was substantial brick construction with thick walls and small windows. Coates had fortified it further using furniture, plantation equipment, and earthworks to create additional barriers. The structure sat on cleared ground, offering no cover for attackers. Defenders could see approaching forces from hundreds of yards away and prepare reception with concentrated fire. Every tactical calculation suggested this assault would fail catastrophically. Horry rode forward with Marion to observe the position personally. Seeing the fortifications confirmed his worst fears. This wasn't like Fort Watson, where they could engineer advantage through creative problem-solving. This was brutal mathematics. Attackers crossing open ground against defenders behind brick walls with clear fields of fire. Artillery could breach those walls eventually. Infantry assault without artillery meant climbing over bodies until either attackers overwhelmed defenders through sheer numbers or attackers broke from unsustainable casualties. This is a mistake. We should withdraw and recommend Green bring artillery. Marion's face showed strain of command pressure. Green needs momentum maintained. Every delay gives British time to reinforce their remaining positions. We take Quimby Bridge now or risk losing the strategic initiative. We'll lose men unnecessarily. Good men who fought with us for months. I know, but sometimes necessary and unnecessary aren't distinguishable until afterward. If we win quickly, it's brilliant tactics. If we fail, it's wasteful stupidity. We won't know which until we try. The logic was coldly accurate and strategically sound, but Horry's tactical instincts screamed warnings that attacking this position with available forces violated every principle of guerrilla warfare they had successfully applied for 2 years. Strike where you have advantage. Avoid battles you can't win through superior preparation. Never commit to engagements where enemy holds overwhelming defensive benefits. Quimby Bridge violated all those principles, but Marion commanded. Horry would execute orders even while believing them wrong. That was the bargain of military hierarchy. Commanders made strategic decisions. Subordinates implemented them regardless of personal reservations. The alternative was chaos where every officer did whatever felt right, destroying coordination and turning armies into armed mobs. The assault began at mid-afternoon. Marion's force advanced across open ground toward the brick plantation house. Horry led his contingent from horseback, knowing visibility mattered more than personal safety. Men took courage from leaders who shared danger prominently. British fire erupted from every window and firing position as Americans came into effective range. The volume was devastating and immediately catastrophic. Militiamen fell dead and wounded with every British volley. The advance stalled as soldiers instinctively sought whatever minimal cover existed or simply dropped flat, hoping to avoid the killing fire. Officers shouted commands that nobody could hear over the continuous roar of musket fire. The careful formations that looked precise during planning dissolved into chaos as men scattered trying to survive rather than advance. Horry saw the attack collapsing in real time and made desperate calculation. Only chance for success was overwhelming violence that reached the walls before defenders could reload continuously. "Forward! Don't stop! Charge!" He spurred his horse into gallop directly toward the house. Some men followed, driven by example or recklessness, or the strange courage that emerges in combat when death seems inevitable regardless of action. Others remained pinned by British fire, unable to move forward and unwilling to retreat without orders. The charge covered 50 yards before British defenders concentrated fire on the obvious target, mounted officer leading from the front. Multiple musket balls struck Horry's horse simultaneously. The animal screamed and collapsed forward, momentum carrying it into tumbling crash that threw Horry hard into the ground. Impact drove air from his lungs and sent white pain through his shoulder where he landed badly. For a moment he couldn't breathe or move, pinned partially beneath the dead horse's weight and stunned from the fall. British soldiers on the walls reloaded with methodical precision, taking aim at the downed officer who represented visible leadership. Horry saw the musket barrels leveling at him and accepted with strange calm that this was how it ended. After 2 years of guerrilla warfare, countless operations, dozens of successful raids, it would finish in failed assault on a brick house in South Carolina, summer heat. The irony would be amusing if he survived to appreciate it. 2 militiamen charged forward under concentrated fire. They grabbed Horry's arms and dragged him backward toward minimal cover, hauling him free from the dead horse and pulling him behind a slight ground depression that offered marginal protection from British fire. One of the rescuers took a musket ball through his thigh during the extraction, blood spurting in arterial rhythm. He fell beside Horry, face twisted with pain but voice remarkably steady. "Worth it, Colonel. Can't let you die out there. We need you." The simple faith in those words carried more weight than any military decoration. These men trusted him enough to risk death for his survival. The responsibility felt crushing. Horry regained his feet, shoulder throbbing but functional. Around him, the assault had completely disintegrated. Dead and wounded covered the approach to the plantation house. Survivors huddled behind whatever cover existed. Officers attempted to rally men for renewed attack, but nobody moved forward. The mathematics had spoken definitively. This position couldn't be taken without artillery support or unsustainable casualties. Marion recognized reality and ordered withdrawal. The force pulled back under covering fire, dragging wounded and leaving dead for later recovery. British defenders didn't pursue, content with having repelled the assault successfully. The engagement ended with approximately 30 Americans killed or wounded against perhaps 5 British casualties. Clear tactical defeat by any measure. Horry sat in the makeshift field hospital that evening, watching surgeons work on wounded men. The militiaman who had saved him lay on a crude operating table while a surgeon probed for the musket ball in his thigh. The man bit down on leather to muffle screams as the surgeon dug into damaged tissue. Finally, the ball came free with wet sucking sound. The surgeon packed the wound with lint and bound it tightly. "You'll live. Might walk with a limp, but you'll live." The wounded man's eyes found Horry. "Did we take it, Colonel?" Honesty seemed required. "No, we failed." "Then I got shot for nothing." The words twisted like knives in Horry's chest. "No, you got shot because I made a mistake. I should have objected harder to Marion. I should have refused orders I knew were wrong. Your blood is on my hands more than the British who shot you." The man considered this through pain-induced haze. "Officers got to follow orders same as soldiers. Ain't your fault Marion made bad call. I'm supposed to provide tactical judgment. I knew this would fail and said nothing forceful enough to stop it. Then learn from it. Make sure next time you speak up louder." The simple wisdom cut through Horry's self-recrimination. The wounded man was right. Mistake made, lesson learned. The question was whether he'd have courage to voice dissent more forcefully next time command judgment seemed wrong. Military culture discouraged subordinates questioning superiors, but effectiveness required honest assessment of tactical realities, even when that meant challenging authority. Marion found Horry as sunset painted the sky orange and red. The older man looked exhausted and defeated in ways that physical fatigue alone couldn't explain. He sat beside Horry in silence for several minutes before speaking. "This is on me. I ordered the attack against your judgment. Those men died because I made a mistake. We both made it. I should have pushed back harder. Perhaps, but final decision was mine. I commanded. I'm responsible." They sat together watching twilight deepen into darkness. Around them, the brigade settled into defensive positions, tending wounded and mourning dead. The victory momentum that had carried them through spring and early summer felt broken by Quimby Bridge. Not destroyed, but damaged in ways that simple time wouldn't repair. Trust required success. Failure created doubt. Too many failures, and men stopped believing their leader's judgment was sound. "What do we do now?" Marion's response came slowly. "We remember what we're good at. Guerrilla warfare. Ambushes, raids, surprise attacks where we control timing and terrain. We stopped trying to be conventional army we're not equipped to be. Quimby Bridge happened because I forgot our strengths and attempted operations beyond our capabilities. Green will be disappointed. Green will understand. He's fought enough battles to know that tactical failure is part of warfare. What matters is learning from mistakes rather than repeating them." The conversation ended there. Both men understood that words couldn't undo casualties or restore confidence shattered by defeat. Only future success would accomplish that. They had to demonstrate that Quimby Bridge was an anomaly, not indication of declining effectiveness. The challenge was maintaining militia morale while conducting operations careful enough to avoid similar disasters. 3 days later, a courier arrived with news that transformed everything about the Revolutionary War. Lord Cornwallis, commanding the main British field army in the south, had surrendered at Yorktown in Virginia. Over 7,000 British soldiers were now prisoners. The entire British Southern strategy had collapsed catastrophically. The army that was supposed to conquer the South colony by colony had instead been trapped on a peninsula by Franco-American cooperation, besieged, and forced to capitulate. The strategic implications were immediately obvious to anyone with basic military understanding. The British had lost, not just a battle or a campaign, but the political will to continue fighting a war that consumed blood and treasure without producing victory. Independence was won. The formal declaration would take time, negotiations and treaties and diplomatic formalities. But the fundamental question was resolved. America would be independent. Marion's brigade received the news with stunned disbelief followed by erupting celebration. Men who had fought for 2 years through impossible odds, who had survived swamp warfare, in British pursuit and constant danger, finally allowed themselves to believe victory was real. They shouted and fired muskets into the air and embraced each other with joy born from relief. The nightmare was ending. They had survived. Their cause had prevailed. Horry felt relief more than joy. Yorktown meant the strategic war was won, but tactical fighting would continue until formal peace. British forces still held Charleston and New York. Loyalist militias still operated throughout the countryside. Men would still die in skirmishes and ambushes until diplomats in Paris signed documents making independence official. The fighting would decline in intensity and frequency, but it wouldn't stop immediately. Soldiers couldn't simply go home while enemy forces remained in their colony. In October 1781, Greene reorganized Patriot forces into more formal military structure. Marion's brigade became officially incorporated into the South Carolina Continental Line with regular military status. Marion received a commission as brigadier general. Horry became lieutenant colonel in the Continental Army. They were no longer irregular guerrillas operating independently in the swamps. They were regular officers commanding Continental troops under Greene's direct authority. The transition was uncomfortable and awkward for men accustomed to guerrilla independence. Marion and Horry had made quick tactical decisions without consulting higher command, launched operations based on immediate intelligence without waiting for approval, and maintained operational security through mobility that formal military structures couldn't replicate. Now they operated within hierarchical command systems with regulations, paperwork, supply requisitions, and chains of command designed for conventional warfare rather than guerrilla operations. The freedom that made their campaign effective was constrained by military bureaucracy. Horry found himself filling out forms requesting ammunition allocations, filing reports justifying expenditures, and attending command meetings that discussed logistics rather than tactics. The work was necessary for maintaining larger armies but felt suffocating after 2 years of operational independence. Both men accepted the change as necessary for transitioning from guerrilla resistance to legitimate military force, but acceptance didn't make it comfortable. Through late 1781 and 1782, Marion and Horry's regiment conducted operations around Charleston, containing the British garrison within the city and preventing raids into the countryside. These operations lacked the desperate intensity of 1780 and 1781. British forces weren't trying to conquer anymore. They were trying to evacuate safely while negotiations for permanent peace treaty proceeded in Paris. Marion and Horry weren't fighting for survival. They were managing strategic stalemate, maintaining military pressure until formal peace could be achieved. The missions were necessary but less dramatic, patrolling to prevent British foraging parties from seizing provisions, escorting supply convoys, gathering intelligence about British evacuation preparations, demonstrating continued Patriot military capability. Important work that prevented British exploitation of the interim period, but nothing like the dramatic raids and ambushes that defined earlier campaign. In August 1782, British forces mounted a foraging expedition from Charleston to seize rice and provisions from Patriot plantations along the Combahee River. These foraging operations were necessary because the Charleston garrison depended on local food supplies that had to be taken by force since Patriot civilians wouldn't sell voluntarily. Marion and Horry intercepted the British force with approximately 300 men, a substantial Continental and militia combined force. The engagement at Combahee Ferry was sharp but brief, exactly the kind of sudden violent action that Marion and Horry had perfected over 3 years of guerrilla warfare. British foragers were vulnerable, scattered across multiple plantation sites while loading wagons with seized rice. Marion and Horry coordinated simultaneous attacks on multiple positions, preventing British concentration for effective defense. Horry led cavalry charge that overruns one British position with sabers and pistols. The fighting was close and brutal, but decisive within minutes. Horry's saber caught a British officer across the shoulder, spinning him backward. The man fell, dropping his pistol. Horry wheeled his horse and charged the next position, where British soldiers tried desperately to form defensive line. They broke before the charge reached them, running toward boats on the river. Some made it. Others were ridden down by pursuing cavalry. The whole action lasted perhaps 20 minutes from first shot to final surrender. British casualties were light, several killed, more wounded, most captured. More importantly, they lost their entire wagon train of seized provisions. Survivors fled back toward Charleston empty-handed and demoralized. Marion and Horry's forces suffered minimal casualties while completely accomplishing their mission. Perfect guerrilla action. Strike suddenly at vulnerable targets, inflict damage disproportionate to force committed, seize valuable supplies, withdraw before enemy reinforcements arrive. After 3 years of developing and refining these tactics, they executed with professional competence that made success look easy. As the British prisoners were marched away, Horry sat on his horse watching the captured supply wagons. The rice would feed Patriot forces for weeks. The operation had been textbook perfect, but standing there in aftermath of minor skirmish that wouldn't rate a footnote in history books, Horry realized something profound. This was probably his last combat action. The war was ending, not with climactic battle, but with gradual disengagement in diplomatic negotiation. His fighting days were finished. The thought brought neither joy nor sadness, just quiet recognition that a chapter of his life was closing. He'd spent 3 years living in swamps, leading raids, risking death repeatedly for independence. Now independence was won, and the risks would end. He could return to what remained of his plantation, rebuild what the British had destroyed, resume the life that war had interrupted. The prospect felt simultaneously attractive and somehow insufficient. Combat was terrible, but it provided clarity of purpose that civilian life often lacked. Fighting for survival focused everything. Peacetime required finding purpose in mundane daily activities. Marion rode up beside him, studying the captured wagons with professional satisfaction. Well executed, perfect guerrilla action. Thank you. I think that's the last time we'll do this. The war's ending. British are evacuating. We'll patrol and contain, but no more raids. That's probably good. I'm tired. So am I. I thought I'd feel more triumphant when it ended. Instead, I just feel old. They sat together in silence, two men who had fought impossible odds and somehow won. The victory was real but felt anticlimactic. History would record this as decisive American victory achieved through French support and British strategic failures. The guerrilla campaign in South Carolina that kept resistance alive during the darkest days would receive minimal recognition. Marion might be remembered briefly. Horry would likely be forgotten completely. That was how history worked. Not fair, not accurate, but inevitable. What will you do when peace comes? Marion's response was immediate. Write it down, everything we did, before memories fade and the truth gets lost. I want accurate record of what actually happened. You want me to help? I need you to help. You executed half the operations. Without your perspective, the story is incomplete. Horry nodded agreement. Preserving historical truth felt important, even if nobody read the resulting manuscript. They had done something significant. Future generations deserved to know about it accurately, rather than through mythologized versions that simplified complexity into patriotic fairy tales. The war ended not with climactic battle, but with diplomatic negotiation and gradual military disengagement. The Treaty of Paris was signed in September 1783, formally recognizing American independence and establishing boundaries for the new nation. British forces evacuated Charleston in December 1783, ending nearly 4 years of occupation. South Carolina was free. The United States of America existed as independent sovereign nation. Peter Horry had spent 3 years fighting to make that outcome possible. He'd led dozens of raids, ambushes, and military operations. He'd suffered wounds and hardship. He'd lost friends and comrades to battle, disease, and exhaustion. He'd risked everything for independence. But he'd won. The cause he believed in had prevailed. British had been defeated and driven from South Carolina. American independence was secured. Victory justified every sacrifice and every hardship endured since 1780. The post-war years brought challenges that had nothing to do with military operations and everything to do with survival in a different kind of wilderness. Horry returned to his Waccamaw plantation in early 1784 to find systematic destruction that went beyond what British raiders had accomplished during their initial visit. Loyalist forces had returned multiple times through 1781 and 1782, burning what remained, destroying irrigation systems, killing livestock, and liberating enslaved workers who either fled north or were seized by retreating British forces. The fields lay fallow after 3 years without cultivation, overgrown with weeds and scrub that would require months of labor to clear. Fences had collapsed, equipment was broken or stolen, the barns that hadn't burned stood empty. The economic infrastructure that sustained plantation operations had been systematically eliminated. Worse, the crop that had made low-country planters wealthy before the Revolution no longer had value. Britain had provided bounties for indigo production, making it profitable despite difficult cultivation. With independence, those bounties vanished. The indigo market collapsed overnight. Horry would need to transition to rice cultivation, which required different techniques, different equipment, and massive investment in irrigation and milling infrastructure he couldn't afford. He stood in the ruins at dawn, watching morning light illuminate the scope of destruction. Margaret and the children had returned from North Carolina, but the reunion was strained. They had survived the war. Now they faced the possibility of losing everything to economic collapse despite military victory. The children had grown during his absence, their faces showing years he had missed. His oldest son was nearly a man, helping with reconstruction work. His daughter had married during the war, husband killed at Guilford Courthouse. She'd returned home a widow at 19. Margaret walked through the ruins with practical assessment, calculating what could be salvaged. We'll need credit to replant. Do we have any? Not much. Most Charleston merchants are bankrupt themselves. Then we start small. Plant what we can afford. Build back gradually. That could take a decade. Then it takes a decade. We didn't survive the war to quit because peace is hard. Her pragmatism was simultaneously comforting and exhausting. Horry wanted to feel triumphant about independence, but triumph required leisure that poverty couldn't afford. He needed to focus on immediate survival, securing seed, hiring labor, repairing irrigation, negotiating credit terms with merchants who themselves faced uncertain futures. The work demanded different skills than leading guerrilla raids. No more tactical planning or combat operations. Instead, agricultural management, business negotiation, financial planning, labor recruitment. The transition tested Horry in ways that combat never had. Battle was simple. See the enemy, kill them, survive. Peacetime required patience with problems that had no quick solutions, negotiation with people who held leverage, and managing complex operations where success meant grinding daily progress rather than dramatic breakthrough. He discovered that the same man who could lead midnight cavalry charges through swamps could also manage plantation operations requiring careful planning and sustained effort. The skills weren't identical, but they overlapped. Both required seeing problems clearly, planning systematically, executing decisively. Through 1784 and 1785, Horry rebuilt gradually. He negotiated credit arrangements with Charleston factors who remembered his pre-war reputation for honest dealing. He recruited labor, a process complicated by the fact that slavery continued despite the Revolution's rhetoric about liberty. Horry faced the moral contradiction daily, fighting for freedom while denying it to others. He had no comfortable resolution to that tension. Abolition would come eventually or it wouldn't. But individual plantation owners couldn't restructure Southern economy unilaterally without destroying themselves financially. The rationalization was self-serving, and he knew it. But knowledge didn't create alternatives. He needed labor to produce crops. Crops required investment he could only make through exploiting workers he didn't compensate. The system was morally bankrupt but economically functional. Horry participated while recognizing its injustice, which perhaps made him slightly less terrible than participants who believed exploitation was righteous. Slightly less terrible wasn't the same as good. Jacob had remained with him through the war's end, then departed in 1783 when British evacuation created opportunities for freedmen in Charleston. They met once more in 1786 when Horry traveled to the city for business. Jacob had established himself as a carpenter, building furniture for wealthy merchants and slowly accumulating capital. He'd married, started a family, created life from freedom's possibilities. They shared a meal at a tavern, conversation awkward with the weight of shared history and changed circumstances. Finally, Jacob spoke directly. "You look troubled. Plantation rebuild not going well?" "It's going adequately. Just slower than I'd like." "That's not what troubles you." Horry smiled despite himself. "You still read me too well. So tell me what's actually wrong. I fought for 3 years so men could be free. Now I'm home, and I'm still denying freedom to people I claim to respect. The hypocrisy is hard to live with." Jacob's expression showed neither sympathy nor condemnation. "You want absolution? I can't give it? You want permission to feel good about necessary evil? That's cowardice dressed as pragmatism. You're participating in something wrong, because changing it would cost you personally. That's a choice. Own it honestly instead of seeking forgiveness from the people you're wronging." The words landed like physical blows. Horry had expected understanding or at least acknowledgement of complexity. Instead, Jacob offered brutal honesty that stripped away comforting rationalizations. "You're right, I'm making excuses." "Yes, but at least you recognize the excuses are excuses. Most people convince themselves that exploitation is natural order. You know better. That knowledge is uncomfortable, but it's honest. Maybe that's the best you can manage right now." "Is that enough?" "No, but it's something, and something is better than nothing." They finished the meal in silence, both understanding that some chasms couldn't be bridged through goodwill alone. The war had created temporary alliance based on mutual danger. Peace revealed that their interests aligned only when survival required cooperation. With survival secured, their paths diverged according to circumstances that goodwill couldn't overcome. Jacob was free and building life on his own terms. Horry owned property worked by people denied the freedom he'd fought to secure. The contradiction would remain unresolved until either slavery ended or Horry died. By 1790, the plantation had recovered enough to generate modest profit. Not the prosperity of pre-war years, but sustainable operation that provided living without accumulating debt. Horry settled into the rhythm of agricultural management, planting and harvest cycles, market negotiations, equipment maintenance, labor supervision. The work was unglamorous but necessary. Someone had to rebuild South Carolina's economic infrastructure after the war's devastation. Men like Horry made that reconstruction possible through competent civilian leadership that received no public recognition because successful business management wasn't dramatic or heroic. Francis Marion visited occasionally, arriving without announcement and staying for dinners that stretched late in the evening. They'd fought together for 3 years, shared dangers that created bonds civilian friendship rarely matched. That shared experience produced relationship that peacetime couldn't replicate. They spoke easily about the war, remembering operations and fallen comrades, but struggled to connect on topics that didn't involve combat or survival. The war had defined them. Without it, they were just two aging planters trying to make peace with ordinary existence. In 1793, Marion raised the topic that would consume Horry's next 15 years. They sat on the rebuilt veranda, watching sunset paint the Waccamaw River orange and gold. Marion's health had declined noticeably. Malaria and old age were winning the battle that British forces never managed. He spoke carefully, choosing words with obvious thought. "We did something important during the war, something that shouldn't be forgotten." "I agree, but it will be forgotten unless we write it down. Memory is fragile. Without written records, the guerrilla campaign will disappear from history or be misremembered by people who weren't there." "You want to write a memoir?" "I want us to write an accurate history, not memoir that glorifies me, but factual account of what actually happened. The tactics we used, the operations we conducted, the mistakes we made. All of it documented before participants die and direct testimony is lost. Horry understood immediately. You're dying. Marion didn't deny it. We're all dying. I'm just closer than most. I want the story told accurately while I can still contribute my perspective. Your memory is better than mine for tactical details. Together we can produce something true. When do we start? Now. Tonight. We'll work whenever I visit. You write, I'll review and correct. We keep going until it's finished or I'm dead, whichever comes first. They began that evening, Horry writing by candlelight while Marion talked through his memories of the war. The process was painstaking and often frustrating. Marion's recollection of dates and sequences was imperfect. Horry's records were incomplete. They argued about details, consulted other veterans, and slowly assembled chronology of the guerrilla campaign. Dates, locations, casualties, tactical objectives, strategic context, everything documented as accurately as aging memory and fragmentary records allowed. Marion died in February 1795 before the work was complete, leaving Horry to continue alone. Standing at Marion's grave, Horry felt the peculiar loneliness of surviving your close friends. They'd fought together through impossible circumstances, trusted each other completely, and created something significant through their partnership. Now Marion was gone, and Horry remained, carrying sole responsibility for preserving their shared history. He worked on the manuscript sporadically over the next decade, adding details and refining narrative structure. The document grew to several hundred pages, comprehensive account of the guerrilla campaign from 1780 through 1783, operations at Black Mingo, Fort Watson, Quinby Bridge, Combahee Ferry, the tactics and philosophy that made them effective, the costs and compromises that success required. Horry wrote honestly, including failures alongside victories, acknowledging mistakes and moral ambiguities that sanitized history would erase. By 1805, he had completed what he believed was accurate historical record. But the manuscript sat unpublished because Horry lacked resources to print it, and publishing companies showed no interest in military memoirs from secondary commanders. Marion's name carried some recognition, but Horry's didn't. Publishers wanted marketable content that would sell copies, not scholarly accuracy that appealed to historians. The manuscript languished in Horry's study, testimony to effort that might never reach public audience. In 1806, a visitor arrived at the plantation who would change everything about how the guerrilla campaign was remembered. Mason Locke Weems, better known as Parson Weems, presented himself as biographer specializing in patriotic stories designed to inspire moral virtue in American youth. He'd already published an enormously successful biography of George Washington that invented the fictional cherry tree story. Weems understood intuitively that the public wanted heroes, not history. Truth was less marketable than mythology. He proposed partnership with Horry. Combine Horry's factual manuscript with Weems's narrative skills to produce biography of Marion that would reach mass audience. Horry's initial reaction was skepticism. I spent 10 years documenting what actually happened. I'm not interested in inventing stories. Weems's response radiated practiced charm. Of course not. Your factual foundation is essential. But dry military history doesn't sell. People want stories with emotion, drama, personal connection. I simply add narrative elements that make historical facts accessible to general readers. You mean you fictionalize? I enhance. There's a difference. Is there? Absolutely. Your manuscript provides skeleton. I add flesh that brings it to life. Together we create something both accurate and popular. Your facts, my storytelling. Marion gets the recognition he deserves. You preserve the historical record. Everyone benefits. The logic was seductive. Horry wanted Marion's contributions remembered. He wanted the guerrilla campaign documented for posterity. If working with Weems was necessary to achieve publication, perhaps compromise was justified. Not ideal, but acceptable as means to worthwhile end. He agreed to partnership with explicit conditions. Weems could improve narrative flow and add dialogue to make scenes more vivid, but he couldn't invent major events or fabricate battles that never happened. Weems agreed enthusiastically. They signed contract giving Weems rights to publish the biography with Horry receiving modest royalties. Weems took the manuscript back to his home, promising to return with revised version for Horry's approval within months. Horry felt cautiously optimistic. His years of work might finally reach public audience. Marion's legacy would be preserved. The guerrilla campaign would be documented for future historians. The optimism lasted until October 1808, when Weems sent the revised manuscript. Horry opened the package on a morning that began ordinarily and descended into rage so profound it made his hands shake. He carried the manuscript to his study and began reading. The first chapter transformed Marion's actual military service into romantic fiction suitable for parlor reading. Invented dialogue had Marion speaking eloquently about liberty in ways the actual man never would. A fictional encounter had Marion meeting a beautiful loyalist woman who fell in love with him despite political differences, then tragically died protecting him from British ambush. None of this happened. Weems had simply invented romantic subplot that existed nowhere in Horry's factual manuscript. Horry continued reading with mounting horror. The tactical details he'd carefully documented were present, but surrounded by monstrous absurdities that Weems had created from imagination. Marion giving speeches about virtue that sounded like sermons, tactical victories achieved through implausible coincidences or divine providence, battles that never occurred, invented to provide dramatic moments, conversations that couldn't have happened because the participants never met. The entire manuscript was patriotic fiction wearing historical clothing. Worst of all, Horry's own contributions were reduced to occasional supporting role. The biography was titled The Life of General Francis Marion, not the partnership of Marion and Horry. Weems focused almost entirely on Marion, relegating Horry to footnotes or passing mentions. Operations that Horry had planned and led personally were attributed to Marion or omitted entirely. The tactical brilliance, personal courage, and essential partnership that made the campaign successful, all subsumed into Marion mythology or ignored completely. Horry's carefully documented history of what actually happened had been gutted and replaced with fiction designed to sell books and inspire children. The truth he'd spent 15 years preserving was buried under layers of invented mythology that Weems created for commercial success and moral instruction. He sat in his study, staring at pages that represented betrayal of everything he'd tried to accomplish. 10 years of work with Marion, 5 more years finishing alone, all destroyed by a man more interested in entertaining readers than preserving truth. He wrote to Weems immediately, letter pouring out fury and disbelief. "Sir, you have taken our real history and transformed it into monstrous absurdities. General Marion would be mortified by these romantic embellishments. The truth was hard enough, heroic enough. It needed no fiction. Most painful. You've erased the contributions of men who bled in those swamps. You've made heroes into legends and legends into lies. I saved your life in 1781 when British forces raided your family's plantation. You've repaid me by destroying my efforts to save the truth." The last accusation wasn't rhetoric. Horry had suddenly remembered the civilians they'd rescued during a British raid in 1781. Among them was a young man named Mason Weems, barely 20 years old, terrified and grateful to Marion's brigade for extracting him from danger. Horry had personally led that rescue operation, risking his life and his men's lives to save civilians who would otherwise have been killed or captured. One of those civilians now repaid the debt by destroying Horry's historical legacy for profit. The irony was devastating. The man whose life Horry saved became the man who erased Horry from history. There was cosmic injustice in that betrayal that went beyond simple disappointment. Horry had given Weems life. Weems had taken Horry's meaning. Weems's response arrived 3 weeks later. The tone was coldly professional, businessman defending product against unreasonable complaints. "Colonel Horry, the public prefers inspiration to accuracy. Your manuscript was scholarly but unmarketable. My version will sell thousands of copies and preserve Marion's name for posterity. Is that not the goal? Your contributions are acknowledged where appropriate. That you desire more recognition suggests vanity unbefitting an officer. The work is already at the printer. Publication proceeds as contracted." The finality was crushing. Weems had legal rights to publish. Horry had signed them over when he trusted Weems's promises about maintaining factual accuracy. He had no recourse except watching the book appear and knowing that generations would learn about the swamp fox from fictionalized account that bore almost no resemblance to reality. The war for historical truth was lost before Horry realized it was being fought. The Life of General Francis Marion, published in 1809 and became an immediate bestseller, going through multiple editions and reaching tens of thousands of readers. Generations of Americans learned about the swamp fox from Weem's romantic fiction. The real history that Horry tried desperately to preserve was buried under mythology that Weems created for commercial success. Marion became legend while Horry disappeared into historical obscurity, remembered only as occasional supporting character in someone else's story. The outcome was deeply ironic and tragic. Horry had fought for 3 years to create American independence through real guerrilla warfare in actual swamps against genuine British forces. He'd survived hardship, danger, and trauma that would have broken lesser men. He'd wanted that true story told accurately so future generations would understand what the revolution actually required: moral compromise, Civil War violence, strategic patience, and persistent courage in face of impossible odds. Instead, Weems transformed reality into patriotic fiction that erased complexity in favor of inspiring simplicity. The revolution became a tale of virtuous heroes defeating evil enemies through divine favor and personal virtue. The moral ambiguities, strategic calculations, and tactical brutality that defined actual guerrilla warfare disappeared from the narrative. History became mythology, and mythology became what people believed was truth. Horry spent his final years watching his legacy dissolve. Friends and neighbors who hadn't fought in the war assumed Weems's book was accurate. They congratulated Horry on his service with Marion, referencing events that never happened and attributing decisions to Marion that Horry had made. He stopped correcting them after a while. What was the point? People believed what they wanted to believe. Contradicting popular mythology made him seem bitter or delusional. In 1813, Horry received a letter from a young historian researching the Revolutionary War. The man had read Weems's biography and wanted Horry's perspective on Marion's tactical genius. Horry's response was carefully worded, trying to inject truth without seeming to attack the published record. Marion was indeed a capable commander with strong strategic vision. However, the biography you reference contains numerous inaccuracies and invented episodes. The actual campaign was less romantic and more brutal than portrayed. Many officers contributed significantly to our success, and attributing everything to Marion alone misrepresents how guerrilla warfare actually functioned, the historian never replied. Horry's corrections went unacknowledged, probably dismissed as jealous revision from a forgotten secondary figure. The mythology was too established to challenge. Weem's fiction had become accepted history. Truth couldn't compete with stories people preferred. The War of 1812 erupted, providing brief resurgence of national crisis. Horry was too old to fight, but he followed campaigns closely, analyzing tactics and strategic decisions with the systematic attention that decades of military experience instilled. British forces burned Washington but failed to capture Baltimore. Andrew Jackson won decisive victory at New Orleans after the peace treaty was signed. The war ended with American independence confirmed beyond doubt. The United States had survived its first major international conflict as independent power. Watching the war from South Carolina, Horry felt vindicated and irrelevant simultaneously. The nation he'd fought to create had survived its second confrontation with British power. American independence was permanent reality, not temporary condition, subject to reversal if Britain decided to reconquer. Everything he'd risked in the swamps from 1780 to 1783 had been worth it. The cause succeeded, the nation endured, but his personal contribution remained forgotten. History books mentioned Marion occasionally, usually with facts drawn from Weem's fictionalized biography. Horry's name appeared rarely, if at all. The independent operations he'd led, the tactical innovations he'd implemented, the partnership with Marion that made the campaign effective, all erased from collective memory or attributed to others. He'd fought for something larger than personal glory, and he'd achieved that larger goal. Independence was won. That should be sufficient. Yet it wasn't. Not entirely. Horry recognized the feeling as vanity, the desire for recognition that philosophical detachment should overcome. He'd done important work. That work contributed to successful outcome. The contribution's value didn't depend on public acknowledgement. These truths were philosophically sound and emotionally unsatisfying. He wanted people to know, not for glory or fame, but because truth mattered. Because history that erased half the participants to simplify narrative was fundamentally dishonest. Because future generations deserved to understand that independence required contributions from countless individuals, not just famous generals whose names appeared in textbooks. The revolution was made by regular people making extraordinary choices, and those choices deserved documentation, even if documentation never reached wide audience. In early 1815, Horry's health declined rapidly. 78 years of accumulated wear, finally overwhelming constitutional strength that had survived guerrilla warfare, malaria, combat wounds, and decades of agricultural labor. He took to his bed in March, surrounded by family who understood he wouldn't recover. His children gathered, grandchildren he barely knew, and Margaret, who'd survived alongside him through war and Reconstruction. One grandson, perhaps 10 years old, showed curiosity that others didn't. "Grandfather, tell us about the war. Tell us what you did." The question offered final opportunity to speak truth that written history had erased. Horry gathered strength and spoke carefully, wanting the boy to understand what revolution actually required, rather than what mythologized histories claimed. "We fought in the swamps because that's where British forces couldn't follow effectively. We used terrain as weapon, striking suddenly and disappearing before they could respond. We disrupted their supply lines, ambushed their patrols, and made occupations so costly they eventually gave up. It wasn't glorious. It was brutal, exhausting, morally complicated. We did things that haunt me still, but we did them because liberty mattered more than comfort and independence justified risks we took." The boy listened with wide eyes. "Why isn't this in the books?" "Because books prefer simple stories to complicated truth. The real war was messy. People don't want messy. They want heroes and villains, clear moral lines, satisfying victories. Reality doesn't provide those things consistently, so history becomes mythology that serves current needs rather than preserving past truth." "That's not fair." "No, but fairness is luxury that history rarely provides. Power determines narrative. Publishers want profitable books. Profitable books simplify complexity. My role was complicated and secondary, so it disappears. Marion's role was important and easier to mythologize, so it survives in distorted form. That's how historical memory works, not justly, but consistently." Margaret spoke from the bedside. "You're too pessimistic. Someone will eventually tell the full story. Perhaps or perhaps not. Either way, I've done what I could. Fought when fighting mattered. Tried to preserve truth afterward. Whether that effort succeeds isn't mine to determine." The grandson persisted. "But you were important. You helped win independence. I was one person among thousands who contributed. My importance is relative, not absolute. Recognizing that distinction is essential for honest historical understanding. We won because many people made important contributions, not because a few heroes performed miracles. That's the truth books should teach, even though they rarely do." The boy seemed dissatisfied with answers that didn't provide heroic certainty. Horry understood. Children wanted clear narratives with obvious morals. Adults who'd lived through historical events knew that clarity was illusion created by distance and selective memory. The real experience was always more ambiguous, more complicated, and less satisfying than simplified versions suggested. Over the next days, Horry drifted between consciousness and semi-awareness, memories surfacing randomly without chronological order. Black Mingo Creek's dawn assault, Fort Watson's impossible tower, Quinby Bridge's disaster, Marion's strategic conversations, Jacob's engineering genius, Samuel Blackwood crying while the plantation burned, the wounded militiaman asking if they'd taken the objective, Weems' letter dismissing accuracy as unmarketable. All of it mixed together, the triumphs and failures and moral compromises that defined his war. He'd made choices that cost lives and choices that saved them. He'd fought for liberty while participating in slavery. He'd tried to preserve truth while watching fiction become accepted history. The contradictions never resolved. Life didn't provide resolution. It provided experiences that you processed as best you could and then died with all the ambiguities intact. Peter Horry died on April 10, 1815, at age 78, surrounded by family on the plantation he'd rebuilt from ashes. Death came quietly without drama or final revelation, just gradual fade from consciousness to nothing. The local newspaper published brief obituary. Colonel Peter Horry, age 78, veteran of the Revolutionary War. Survived by wife Margaret, 4 children, and numerous grandchildren. Services to be held at St. James Santee Church. No mention of Black Mingo Creek or Fort Watson or 3 years of guerrilla warfare that kept independence alive in South Carolina when all seemed lost. No discussion of tactical innovations or strategic partnership with Marion. No acknowledgement of personal courage or persistent determination that characterized his military service. Just basic biographical facts and funeral arrangements. History had already forgotten him before his body was buried. The funeral drew respectable attendance. Fellow veterans came to honor one of their own. Neighbors paid respects to man they'd known for decades. Marion's family sent representative acknowledging Horry's service. But there were no elaborate tributes, no lengthy eulogies celebrating his contributions. No monuments proposed to commemorate his role in winning independence. He was buried in family plot with simple headstone recording name and dates. Nothing more. Within a generation, local memory of his specific contributions faded. The Swamp Fox legend grew, while Peter Horry disappeared into historical obscurity. Marion became synonymous with South Carolina guerrilla resistance, while his second-in-command, who planned and executed many operations, became anonymous footnote occasionally mentioned in passing. History books told simplified version where Marion single-handedly conducted brilliant campaign. Horry's essential role in making that campaign effective was erased from collective memory. The historical injustice reflected broader patterns in how events get remembered. Famous people receive credit for work that many contributed to. Secondary figures who enabled success through practical execution disappear from narrative because their roles are harder to mythologize. Complex partnerships simplify into single hero stories because audiences prefer clear attribution to accurate distribution of credit. History becomes mythology, and mythology becomes accepted truth that nobody questions because contradicting it seems like petty jealousy from forgotten participants. 2 centuries later, historians researching Revolutionary War primary sources would discover Horry's original manuscript in archives. They'd find British Colonel Coates's diary entries describing the ghost force that couldn't be pinned down or defeated. They'd find Jacob's name in plantation records as enslaved worker who became essential military asset. They'd find Horry's bitter correspondence with Weems documenting the betrayal. Slowly, the real story would begin emerging from beneath layers of accumulated mythology. Modern scholarship would recognize that Marion's effectiveness depended crucially on partnership with Horry, whose tactical execution and operational planning transformed strategic vision into battlefield reality. They'd understand that the guerrilla campaign succeeded through coordination between multiple capable officers, not through single genius commander operating alone. They'd acknowledge the contributions of forgotten participants like Jacob, whose skills and courage enabled operations that simplified history attributed exclusively to famous commanders. But this recovery would come far too late for Horry personally. He lived and died in obscurity, watching his legacy dissolve while being powerless to prevent it. The frustration must have been profound. Not just vanity seeking recognition, but genuine desire to preserve accurate record of how independence was actually won. The truth mattered because future generations needed to understand that revolutions required more than famous generals. They required countless individuals making important contributions in roles that simplified history erased. The Waccamaw River flows past the plantation site today, carrying no memory of the man who rebuilt his life there after war destroyed everything. The chimneys that remained standing after the 1780 burning have long since collapsed. The fields that Horry cultivated for 30 years have returned to forest. No marker commemorates his residence or his service. History moved on, remembering Marion vaguely and Horry not at all. Yet beneath the earth, physical evidence remains. Musket balls and equipment from 1780-1782 raids occasionally surface after storms, washed from swamp soil where they've rested for 2 centuries. Archaeological remnants of actions that history forgot. The guerrilla campaign left marks on landscape that persist long after human memory failed. Battlefields remember what books ignore. Earth preserves what documents erase. This physical persistence suggests something important about historical truth. Facts exist independently of whether anyone records them accurately. Events happened regardless of how they are later remembered. Peter Horry led operations that contributed significantly to American independence. That reality doesn't disappear because Parson Weems wrote fiction instead of history. The truth persists even when it's buried, waiting for someone to excavate it with patient research and honest curiosity. Modern historians conducting that excavation discover a story more complicated and more inspiring than mythology provided. They find that independence wasn't won by lone heroes operating through individual genius. It was won by networks of capable people coordinating effectively under impossible circumstances. Marion provided strategic vision. Horry provided tactical execution. Jacob provided engineering expertise. Militia soldiers provided persistent courage. Civilians provided intelligence and supplies. Success emerged from this complex collaboration, not from single brilliant commander. Understanding this complexity makes independence more impressive, not less. Acknowledging that victory required contributions from many people doing difficult work under terrible conditions shows the revolution's true scale. Mythology simplifies and diminishes by suggesting that a few heroes accomplished everything through special qualities that ordinary people lacked. Truth reveals that ordinary people accomplished extraordinary things through persistent effort and mutual support. That's both more accurate and more inspiring than sanitized myths about solitary genius. Peter Horry represented exactly this kind of ordinary person, accomplishing extraordinary things. He wasn't specially qualified for guerrilla warfare. He was plantation owner who made moral choice to keep fighting when pragmatism suggested surrender. He learned tactics through experience rather than innate genius. He succeeded through systematic preparation and careful execution, not brilliant improvisation. His effectiveness came from treating guerrilla warfare as a management problem requiring the same skills he'd applied to plantation operations: planning, logistics, personnel management, and persistent attention to detail. This ordinariness was his greatest strength. Horry proved that regular people with practical skills could contribute significantly to historical events if they chose to engage rather than seeking safety through neutrality. He wasn't hero in mythological sense. He was competent professional who applied his abilities to military problem that needed solving. That kind of contribution was more replicable than genius, more democratic than heroism, and more essential to achieving independence than simplified histories acknowledge. The guerrilla campaign in South Carolina succeeded precisely because it relied on this kind of practical competence rather than depending on special individual brilliance. Marion had strategic vision, but vision without execution accomplishes nothing. Horry provided execution that transformed vision into reality. Together, they demonstrated that effective military forces required both strategic thinking and tactical implementation. Neither was sufficient alone. Both were necessary for success. This lesson extended beyond military operations to broader questions about historical change. Societies transform through combination of vision and execution, thinking and doing, strategy and tactics. Famous leaders who receive historical credit generally provided vision. Forgotten secondary figures who enabled success generally provided execution. Both roles were essential. History's tendency to remember one while forgetting the other creates distorted understanding of how change actually happens. Recovering Horry's story corrects that distortion by showing that transformation requires multiple types of contribution working together. The Swamp Fox legend celebrates Marion's strategic vision while erasing Horry's tactical execution. Complete history acknowledges both, understanding that neither could succeed without the other. Independence required Marion's ability to see how guerrilla warfare fit into broader strategic context. It equally required Horry's ability to plan specific operations that achieved tactical objectives Marion identified. Modern readers encountering this fuller history might wonder why Horry tolerated being erased from the narrative. Why didn't he fight harder to preserve his legacy? Why did he accept Weems's betrayal rather than challenging it publicly? The answer reveals something important about character in historical moment. Horry prioritized cause over personal recognition. His goal was American independence, an accurate historical record of how it was won. When forced to choose between preserving his own reputation and avoiding conflict that might damage Marion's legacy, he chose Marion's legacy. This wasn't weakness. It was conscious choice based on principled priorities. Horry understood that public disputes between Revolutionary War veterans would undermine confidence in their generation's accomplishments. Better to accept personal erasure than create controversy that might diminish public appreciation for independence's cost. The calculation was selfless and strategically sound. It was also personally devastating, which Horry accepted as cost of maintaining commitment to larger principles. That acceptance of personal cost for collective benefit characterized Horry's entire life. He accepted destruction of his plantation to continue fighting. He accepted years of hardship in the swamps rather than seeking British protection. He accepted death risk in dozens of operations. He accepted historical obscurity rather than fighting publicly for recognition. At every choice point, he prioritized principle over personal benefit. That consistency of character, maintained across decades in changing circumstances, represented moral achievement that transcended military accomplishment. The world would have been different if Peter Horry had made different choices. If he'd accepted British protection in 1780, the guerrilla resistance would have lost essential leadership. If he'd refused Marion's assignments, operations would have failed or not been attempted. If he'd prioritized personal glory over effective partnership, the campaign would have been less successful. If he'd fought publicly against Weems's mythology, he might have preserved his legacy at cost of creating division among Revolutionary War veterans. He chose differently at every juncture, and those choices mattered. Not because they made him hero worthy of mythology, but because they demonstrated how ordinary people with strong principles could contribute significantly to historical transformation. Independence wasn't inevitable. It resulted from thousands of individuals making difficult choices in favor of uncertain liberty over comfortable subjugation. Peter Horry was one of those individuals. His choices contributed to outcome that shaped American history for the next 2 centuries. That contribution deserves recognition, even though it comes too late for Horry personally to experience vindication. History is unfair. Credit goes to famous rather than deserving. Mythology displaces truth. These patterns persist across centuries and cultures. But occasionally, through patient research and honest scholarship, forgotten figures emerge from historical shadows to receive acknowledgement their contributions warranted all along. Peter Horry is emerging now, 2 centuries after his death, as historians recover the full story of South Carolina's guerrilla campaign. The recognition comes too late for him, but perhaps not too late for understanding how independence was actually won. The lesson isn't about individual heroism, it's about persistent competence, moral courage, selfless partnership, and willingness to prioritize cause over personal glory. Those qualities build America. They deserve remembrance as much as brilliant strategic vision or dramatic battlefield heroics. The ghost in the swamp wasn't just Marion's army, it was the truth itself, waiting beneath layers of mythology until someone cared enough to excavate with honest curiosity. That truth reveals complexity more inspiring than simplified myths provided. It shows ordinary people accomplishing extraordinary things through choices anyone could make if they had courage and conviction. It demonstrates that history is made by networks of capable individuals working together, not by lone heroes operating alone. Peter Horry made history. History forgot him. Now history is remembering. The process is slow and imperfect, but it's happening. Facts persist even when they're buried. Truth survives mythology eventually. Justice arrives late, but sometimes it arrives. That's the lesson his life teaches. Not about military tactics or revolutionary politics, but about character, persistence, and the patient confidence that truth ultimately matters more than comfortable fiction. He fought 2 wars, one against British Empire that he won, one against historical erasure that he lost. But the verdict on the Second War isn't final. Truth has a way of surfacing after centuries of burial, waiting for someone to recognize its value and bring it back to light. The swamps still hold their secrets. The battlefields still remember. The evidence persists beneath mythology, waiting. Peter Horry's war against historical erasure might yet be won, posthumously and slowly, as scholarship recovers what mythology buried. That would be justice, imperfect and delayed, but real. And perhaps that's sufficient.